Welcome to the BXG Podcast, the podcast where pop culture and nerd culture meet.
You think it's just going to be barbecue sauce?
Because if you actually read those books, it's just gobbledygook.
I really think clothes should be mandatory.
Speaking of Star Wars,
Captain America.
trailer reaction video. A new television show debuted to much acclaim here in the past week from our recording this past Sunday, and HBO's The Last of Us, starring primarily Pedro, Pascal, Bella Ramsey, but also included in this episode Gabrielle Lunas. Just pulling up a cast list here. Excuse me. I was unprepared. It's because I was looking at Eloquist. Gabrielle Luna, Merle Dandridge, Anna Torv, and Nico Parker, alongside Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey in this particular episode. I bumped something. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still
Okay.
hear you.
I don't know. I bumped something.
Loud and clear.
My headset. Obviously, The Last of Us on HBO is adapted from the critically acclaimed and one of the most awarded video games of all time, 2013's The Last of Us, from Naughty Dog Studios, PlayStation exclusive. The show is co-created by one of the creators, Neil Druckmann, alongside Craig Mazin, who's probably most well-known for the Chernobyl series, also on HBO. And at time of recording, Rotten Tomatoes critical review at 99%, audience score 96%. I can speak probably for the next hour on just this episode. I've played The Last of Us Part 1, as it is now known as, extensively. I've completed the game 3 times. I've gotten halfway in and got distracted a handful of other times. So I'm intimately familiar with this, but I'm curious at this point in your life, a non-gamer, someone who a non-video game guy, but with a little bit of knowledge just based on our conversations, but what your feel for this sort of debut episode that was a little bit longer, is about an hour and 20 minutes, for The Last of Us.
Okay, so I'll go off with before I give away like what I actually thought. When you said it was an hour and 20 minutes, I replied like movie length, which I mean that's old school like comedy, like an Adam Sandler comedy movie length of a thing. And I would say a little skeptical of just that length of time. Even if the show's good, we've run into things where that can just be too long sometimes. So I didn't go in negatively. I was just like, ooh, this might be a little long, prepare myself. And I was like, we'll start it up and maybe we'll have to stop it to go to bed and then finish it,
Sure.
at the other half.
Yep.
That didn't happen because it moves and the story is really compelling. It doesn't really stop either. Like that's the other thing. And I mentioned this to you, and it's different to say it probably out loud than to see it in like a text, but it reminded me of watching a video game in like the best possible way and I mean, this is when you see like the preview for a video game and It's like, these are not the sequences that are actually the gameplay or whatever. And you're like, wow, that looks really cool. And then you read that little disclaimer and you're like, oh, so the gameplay is going to look way worse or whatever. And this had this thing where like, oh, this, like the car scene was the one that really stuck out to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sent me the next day the clips of like the stills matched with the video game and the TV show. And they're like almost dead on. I mean, it's hard. It couldn't be more dead on, really, when you do this, which I thought was really cool. I thought the show moved really quickly. I knew the storyline was going to be interesting, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of a show like pilots are hard. They're a hard thing to do, especially, if it's a show that isn't, some like characters we known before, anything like that. And we get a lot of shows now that aren't really anything new a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
They're just kind of rehashed or something. And so that can always be a struggle to introduce people. I mean, some of the best shows of all time have not good pilots. I mean, that's just the way it is sometimes.
Yep.
And then some really, like, some shows that fizzle have really good pilots. It just all kind of goes back. And I mentioned different things on here about really good pilots. Like a really bad pilot, Seinfeld. A really good pilot is the OC. And it's just, and this show, considering what it was doing, which is we have to take a video game and make it into something appealing to people that don't necessarily know anything about the video game, because you're on HBO, you have to hit the wider scheme of things. And I don't know how. I know that the game itself, the first one, part one, is widely considered a great game. I don't know, like, if it's a big game in the sense of like sales or things like that. I just know it's considered a good game. And this is, I didn't look this up intentionally because I wanted to have you talk about on that end of things. I thought the show was terrific. I mean, as good as you can get with this type of thing, where it's serious and it's a lot of stuff going on, but like I never lost track of anything. And I think that could have been a problem. So Pedro Pascal is just on fire right now. I mean, I mentioned that he's at a point now where he would be 15 years ago, he would be Liz Lemon love interest on 30 Rock. That's where he's at now. And it's very cool. So I think this show is really well acted too. I thought the acting was tremendous by everybody involved. He just sticks out though. There's something that, it's funny how people could just kind of come along. He was in other things obviously beforehand, most notably a Sia video making out with Heidi Klum. But
yeah,
for him to really have his moment now with like Mando coming out in 2 months, and not even 2 months now, and then having this show. I mean, I don't know if anybody, and this show's getting incredible reviews, like you mentioned.
Right.
I don't know if anybody's ever been on a show at the same time. They're both, I mean, Mando's going to be awesome this season too. They're going to be so highly rated. And I just think it's awesome. So this show's great. I'm excited for more, but I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, because this is not my wheelhouse of things. This is 100% your wheelhouse.
I think for me, I'm a big fan of the weekly release appointment viewing. And after I watched the first episode of this, I was like, just give it to me all. I'll stay up all night. I will go to work tired. I'll go to work, dead. I just want this whole thing right now. And there's some fundamental changes that have been made to the show from the game that I can kind of get into. But I think that first and foremost, Pedro Pascal as Joel Miller, who is the primary protagonist of The Last of Us Part 1, is like the DNA. It's down to the DNA. And it's very impressive because in the game, he's not Latin, for one. Neither him, I mean, his brother Tommy, also played by Gabriel Luna. But I think that makes sense for the show, because in the beginning sequence, they're in Austin, they're from Texas, they're, I think that makes sense to have this sort of aesthetic where the character kind of wears the face of where he's from a little bit more. The other big difference with that is his daughter, Sarah, in the game is she's little blonde hair, blue eye. And so, what was her name? Nico something or other. The daughter in the show was obviously of that heritage as well. But like I said, I think that makes sense. I think that some of the different shots were so on the nose. You mentioned the car scene, and that's a continuous shot, if I recall correctly from the show. And it's in the moment of the game where you're still kind of unsure what's going on. There's a little bit more lead up, and I think that was, to flesh things out a little bit, and they sort of offered these little hints throughout the way. Obviously something's going on in this other country, and there's her classmates like jittery, and then the older lady, obviously you kind of see her in the faded out background like tweaking out like that. And none of that's really in the game, but I think it was important for the show to sort of establish that sort of thing. And the car scene, I would say from the time that they got into the car to the big moment of that sequence was damn near shot for shot with the game. And we'll get into that in a minute, but flash forward 20 years to Boston, and you kind of see, we get little glimpses of how things have unfolded over the last 20 years, and how people are kind of surviving, and how they're in these bigger cities, but also they're almost like militarized zones, and how they are surviving. And you get a sense from a couple of the scenes that Joel he's just done basically with humanity. And I think that that's going to be a very important theme moving forward. I'm going to attempt to dispel the notion that this is a zombie thing. And that's hard to do because of the fact that, the opening half, or a little longer than a third, is you see this old lady in a wheelchair, and then she gets hyper aggressive and starts biting people, and that's kind of like scream zombie. And then there's as they proceed through the rest of that sequence, people are chowing down on each other and stuff like that. But this is a story about a man who loses his faith in humanity and then continues to regain it. And that's why I think it's The Last of Us, right? And it's because, as you'll see in the coming episodes, the different types of undead antagonists, and I can kind of cover those as well to give know your zombie 101. But they're almost a MacGuffin for this particular story. It's really about the people in the world, how they're getting along, and just how brutal and violent it is. And there's the scene where the woman, they're burning the dead bodies, and the woman cannot pick up the child, who there's a sequence, and that's how they kind of open up with Boston, where there's a child, he walks up to the gates, they bring him in, they hit him with the scan, and he's positive for the cordyceps virus, so they have to euthanize him, which is pretty fucked up, right? And so that's what I mean. And I said this last week when we were talking a little bit about it, this is not a happy show. This isn't a happy game. There's not going to be a lot of moments of levity throughout. I mean, there are some, I think that they inject that at certain points throughout the game, but it's a very harrowing experience. He just tosses the kid in, right? He's just
right. Yeah.
Whatever.
Whatever.
So, and that's the thing, I think, with the game. And I know that they're going to do a part 3, but I almost want them to do something between that moment at the beginning of the outbreak and when we flash forward 20 years to Boston, because it's always kind of alluded to that Joel did really fucked up things during that period of time. And that bears fruit more so in the second game. But you can kind of see he's just and the whole sequence where the Tess character and Robert are, you know, negotiating, and he's, well, what about your friend? And it's like people are afraid of Joel, and it's because of like he just doesn't care, and he's going to survive no matter the cost. He's going to take care of what he has to take care of. So I thought that they did a good job of establishing that character. Like I said, Pedro Pascal it fits like a glove. I did have concerns leading into this about Bella Ramsey. She's a little bit too old for the part. Ellie in the first game, I think, is 13, and she's a little bit older than that. And she doesn't really have the look too much. But as they introduce the character, the biggest part about Ellie is that she has this sort of like shithead teenager attitude, and she nailed it. And it is kind of this funny, like, back and forth throughout their relationship over the course of time, how, you know, Joel has all this old world experience, and Ellie is born 7 years into the outbreak. And so she doesn't understand a lot of that. And that'll be something to kind of keep an eye on in the future for, you know, folks that are not familiar with the game. I was a little bit surprised that they didn't end the episode with the big mid-episode twist. I thought that's where the first episode would probably cut off at.
Oh yeah.
So I was a little bit surprised that they flashed forward, but even in the flash forward scenes, they were very much, it was not necessarily shot for shot, but there are times where you can put like the still screens of the game next to the show and it is identical. And it's crazy because the game's a PS3 game. It's a late generation PS3 game, and it still holds up, like in terms of graphical fidelity and all of that stuff. But one-to-one comparisons, I thought that they did an amazing job. I thought about it a lot the next day, and I typically don't. We watch so much now, right, for the show, even on our own, and it's like you don't carry things with you. But I love the game so much, and like I said, I've played it multiple times, and it's in my probably top 3 or 4. And the story itself is, as I've said many times, it's my favorite story. So seeing them adapt this so far, I mean, it's one episode, but I think that sign of good things to come, like so respectfully and so carefully, and, you know, with so much love for the original product, that it's just really encouraging. And I do think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that Neil Druckmann, who was one of the 2 main creators on the game, has had such a hand in this. And I think that as we continue along this path where we're going to become very inundated with all of these game adaptations, there's Horizon coming to Netflix. Obviously, there was the Halo thing over on Paramount. God of War is coming to Amazon. I think it's important that those creative people who created these things in the first place have a voice in that. And because that will almost assure to some extent that the material is being accurately and carefully represented. But with all that being said, I kind of want to get into some of your thoughts regarding a couple of the different specific scenes. And I think that we can start with, you know, the shocking death in the middle of the episode. So if you haven't watched it yet, and it's a big one, right? So if you haven't watched it yet, and you know, you don't want to be spoiled, first of all, just pause this and go watch it. Get out of your car and go watch it. You know what I mean? Like, right. Stop, like land the plane and watch this show. But with all that being said, we are going to get into some spoilers for the meat and potatoes of the episode. Sarah's death is what kind of catapults Joel into this life of just being numb and doing whatever he has to do to survive, regardless of how amoralistic it is, or brutal, or violent, or cutthroat, whatever have you. What was your kind of feeling leading up to that, and then when it actually occurred?
I mean, I think based on just kind of like knowing a little bit about the game, I knew it was gonna happen. I just didn't know exactly like when.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it happened, it was still like a holy shit moment, because it was just so boom, like, and it's super sad. And then it's kind of like, he's sad, obviously, and you can kind of see it in his eyes of like, well, F this world kind of mentality. You can see that flip where he's trying to like be a good person, trying to, all this stuff up to this point, and then that happens, and he's like, well, screw this. To just see it visually was like, it was so impactful, and it showed that, it just shows you what this, the game is about then, and then also what the TV, show will end up being about, is this guy, obviously goes and turns into a different kind of person than he was beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
So it really impactful. I mean, it was
yeah,
really,
I mean, and that's the thing
intense.
is it's the show's 10 years later, and so there is that sort of almost Luke, I am your father, like specter of things hanging over the whole thing, where it's like, well, I mean, Bella Ramsey's the star of this show, and we really don't see this girl in many previews. So what's up with that? But I'll tell you what, when you play the game blind, not knowing anything about it beforehand,
right,
it's an absolute gut punch. And it very much sets the stage for the rest of the show. Once we're in Boston, you kind of see, and I would say this is where there's two big differences. One big difference, and I think this was an important change that they made in the game. You can contract the cordyceps virus, which, by the way, is a real thing. Neil Druckmann saw a documentary on the cordyceps in insects in an airport somewhere, and was like, that would make a really great concept for a game. And now here we are. It can be passed by being bitten, and it can be passed by breathing in the spores, because as we'll see in the next few episodes, when we get into the creatures who have been infected longer, they're very like mushroom-esque, and so they give off spores. And so in the game, the characters are constantly in gas masks, constantly. And I feel like they made the change for where it's like, however it's like touch or what have you, versus the spores, breathing in the spores, is they don't want these characters who they're paying a lot of money for, and people know Pedro Pascal's face, and we already have a show where he's behind a mask 95% of the time. So I think that was probably a good change that they made. The other change was that in the show, they're really pumping this narrative that Joel's trying to get back to Tommy, and he's trying to find a car battery to get back to Tommy. And that's not the case in the game. When you come across Joel 20 years later in Boston, he's just surviving. He's a smuggler. He brings in drugs and guns into the quarantine zone around Boston. And so that was kind of an interesting take. I think that's maybe to give the character a little bit more direction, or maybe make him a little bit more likable, because there is this sense that he's just kind of this rogue, not really like a piece of shit, but like he's just kind of there. He seems kind of listless before he's given this task of transporting this girl. And we conclude the episode with, they are found by this security officer or military guy that Joel has like on the take or whatever. And, he's scanning them, and Tess is clean, and then he's clean, and then she pops up red, and he's about to shoot her, and Joel just goes nuts and beats the guy to death with his bare hands. So now I guess my question would be, what's your feeling moving forward regarding her and the fact that she has been bitten but is not? Because part of the fun for me in this is like seeing what your predictions will be, and like seeing
Sure.
how on the nose or how horribly wrong they are.
I mean, if she's been bitten, and it's one of those things where, I mean, like, I feel like you gotta do something with her eventually, doing something mean in the old, slit the neck here, get rid of her. I feel like you have to do something. I mean, based on other ideas of how this works,
Sure.
unless it's just, a thing where he can somehow be around. I don't know. It's one of those things where, unless there's something I'm missing, where, this can be okay for this period of time, like, you would just be super, super careful, I guess. But I feel like eventually it has to be one thing it leads to one thing where she can't be alive. So that would be my guess.
Sure.
I honestly have no idea any more about this.
Right. So before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ancillary characters here. Marlene, played by Merle Dandridge, is the only, and this is, if you watch the making of the episode after the fact, this is discussed, only character to be recast as her original character from the game. Marlene is the leader of the Fireflies, who are a kind of anti-military movement. The military would probably refer to them as terrorists. Many people look at them as like a resistance sort of feel. Just talk to me maybe a little bit about your predictions for the Fireflies and Marlene, maybe specifically.
I mean, I'm glad I was going to say resistance. I mean, that's what it reminded me of. I entirely of the resistance. So I feel like you track very similar to that, where trying to do everything at all costs. Yeah, I feel like that, and specifically her being the leader at all cost. And I just thought that, I mean, I'm sure that was intentional to as a resistance kind of wink and nod when they did that. I mean, it definitely reminded me of that, like, right off the bat. So my guess is
what do you mean resistance, like from Star Wars?
Yeah.
Well, remember, this came before the resistance in Star Wars, in the sequels. This came before the sequels.
Oh, I guess it did. Yeah, I guess it did. I didn't even realize that. So, because I didn't know when the game actually came out, to be honest. So
2013.
2013. Okay. Wow. Okay. So now it reminds me of the resistance. Now I'm starting to wonder the reverse of, did they take it from the game? Okay. So, I didn't know when the game came out. Okay, cool. It reminded me that, nonetheless, it did remind me of that, like the idea of that, and kind of shady dealings. You're not sure which side people are on too, is kind of that would it made me think of. They could be good, they could be bad, but what we don't know is what the end game is.
Sure.
Because you just don't know with something like this. So that would be my thing. But I just did not know the game was I honestly thought the game was newer than that. That's cool. I mean, this is one thing I did once we knew this show came out. I just did not want to look at it.
Yeah, late gen PS3.
Okay.
The Fireflies play a big part in the series as this sort of hope. And the motto, and it's been used to promote the series, in the darkness, look for the light, sort of thing. And so they're an important group moving forward. We'll say that.
The other thing I'll say is, I think it's always this thing about the resistance is always looked at as good, but we've talked about it as, is that necessarily true all the time? And I think that gets lost in the shuffle of things of, like, we want it to be good because we have this grandiose feeling about these things that, the Imperial Army is, it's all that kind of thing. And so there is, and so I say that in the same respect of, in Star Wars, with that same idea of, yes, it looks good, but we don't really know if is actually good. Or
I think the thing that you'll learn as we move forward and you meet some of the characters outside the sphere of just these core characters is that there is no one who is good in this world at this point. And so there's shades of gray. There are no good guys and bad guys. There's just people trying to survive. And in that situation, desperate people do desperate things. But yeah, the Fireflies are, like I said, pretty important. The character of Tess, who is sort of Joel's maybe part-time lover, confidant, partner, she gets kind of roped into this situation in the same manner as Joel, where they make a deal with Marlene, get her to the other side of town to our people, our squad of Fireflies, and we'll give you whatever it is that you want, car battery, guns, whatever. And so she's kind of at this point with Joel, they're partners in this. But what was your kind of feel for the Tess character?
And definitely living in the gray. I mean, I was going to say, you don't know what she's really after either. And you don't know what anyone's really after, but there's definitely, for me, it feels like, I don't want to say full on backstab, but I feel like something shady is going to go down on that side. I'm just guessing. Like I said, sure. I would, that just based on other things I've ever watched in my life, sure. that character never is just in it for the good stuff. So my guess is some sort of shadiness going on.
We will see. Next episode is one of the more, based on the previews, is kind of a iconic portion of the game where you really run into the clickers for the first time. And those are the characters who have been infected a little bit longer. And then there's even, more progressions from that. So very much looking forward to it. Like I said, it's 99 on Rotten Tomatoes, critical, 96 audience, over 275 Game of the Year awards for the original The Last of Us 2013. It is the second most awarded game in the history of video games, behind only its sequel, The Last of Us Part 2, which garnered 317 Game of the Year awards. The Last of Us Part 1 has sold over 17.5 million copies. So nothing to sneeze at on the commercial side of things as well. And I'm also interested to see how they kind of incorporate the story of how Ellie gets bitten, because that is actually a side story downloadable content that was put into the game after the fact, called Left Behind, and it's been shown in previews, so they're going to explore that. So I'm interested in that. But super excited. Great first episode. Can't wait for more. Expect deep dives into each episode moving forward. I'd be interested to see too. I know they're planning multiple seasons of this. I'm going to be interested to see if it's going to be almost a Game of Thrones situation where the show passes where they're at with the games. I know that they haven't officially confirmed it, but we all know they're working on part 3. And I would look for this to be just a trilogy of games. So I think that the second game's double the size of the first one in terms of length. And so I feel like the second game can probably be chopped up into 2 seasons fairly easily. And then if, when and if there's a third game, that would also probably be about the same size. So I think that we'll probably look at 4 or 5 seasons of this.
I looked it up. Last of Us Part 3 arrives in 2026 on PlayStation 5.
I don't know where you got that, but it's not even. Yeah, it's Forbes. Not even confirmed.
I don't know. I would say that. I would say it doesn't say it's confirmed. It's just that's what they were projecting. So
Yeah. Neil Druckmann has said that there's like at first he said there's an outline, and then he said, well, there's kind of a script, and then there were, all these different things, but like I said, they're working on it, and they'd be foolish not to, because the first game, we get to the end of the first season here, there is the case that could be made that this doesn't need a sequel, and then they made one because money. And the second game, kind of not really a cliffhanger, but it's very open-ended, and so I think that they're certainly going to go back to that world and try to finish this story off, but we shall see. But now we can move on after that lengthy. I don't think we've ever had a TV episode review be that long.
That was a good episode of television.